these people, I think, represent sort of a new generation of sustainability scholar. They are a new generation because, well, not only are they a bit younger than some of us, but also because already from their PhDs and perhaps even from their masters, they have been working both interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And the world has also changed a lot since most of us were early career researchers, even in the past 10 years. And of course, this has affected how you approach research and also the content. So this is why I thought it would be nice to hear this perspective as well. So you have Patrik Henriksson, who is a postdoc researcher at the Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics, dividing his time with wordfish. You have Caroline Schill, who is a postdoc researcher also at the Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics, and Jamila Haider, postdoc researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And Terry, again. We're going to have one more mic, I think, over here. This one, because, yeah. So you get to share that yes. So see if I find my cheat note. So yes. So instead of me introducing what you are actually doing, I thought it would be nice if you could tell that story by answering one or two questions. You can choose if you want to answer one or both. So what is stewardship to you? Mm-hmm. And or how does your work relate to stewardship and what we have heard today? So who wants to go first?
Sure. All right.
Okay, I start. All right, so I was thinking I tell you a bit about my entry point to stewardship. So that is on the individual level. And as Carl Volke actually just highlighted, so it's about the behavior of people, of individuals, and individuals in groups in social ecological systems. So very much in this human environment relationships. And what really fascinates me and interests me is exactly how our actions and behaviors shape the contexts in which we live and how these contexts in turn shape us and our behavior. And to make it a bit more concrete and to get to the stewardship component is so one question that I have been working with now since quite a while, and actually together with Therese, is the question about how we individuals respond to potentially catastrophic ecosystem change. And it's a type of change that would threaten potentially our livelihood, but also a change that we could prevent through collective action. And we looked at that question by using behavioral economic experiments. And when we use these experiments, we really are very much interested, so how does this change, so this potential catastrophic ecosystem change, affects the willingness and the capacity of the people to cooperate and to protect the shared resources that they have. And then we look at how does that affect trust building and communication among the people. There would certainly aspects of care would come up and knowledge because people share their understanding of the situation and also try to make agreements. So in other ways, we are really looking at the potential for stewardship. So that's one example.
Thank you.
Hi. So I can talk a bit more about a practical example because I've been part of this CBOS initiative over the last few years, and I've been working a lot with antimicrobial use. I'm working a lot with aquaculture, so it's been highlighting for these companies how antimicrobial use in their farming systems have very grave consequences, both for their business and both for ocean health and both for human health. And I think that whole process has been very, very interesting to see how the knowledge part of stewardship had actually gotten them to care about the oceans and their therapeutic use in these farms. So I think that's my strongest connection to this topic.
Thanks. Yeah, and I've worked primarily in a development context and with marginalized people who are often stewards of incredible agricultural biodiversity specifically. And I've also been a part of this stewardship group with multiple people in the room here who've been thinking about what stewardship is, and that it isn't one thing, it's many things. And I think that speaks to the, or that's what I really like about the concept, is that it enables this plurality of perspectives. So whether it's an ethic, a motivation, or an outcome, but what resonates most strongly in my work is the idea of stewardship as an action towards sustainability, so as opposed to management, for example. And then what is this action? And at the core of this action, I think, like Aldo Leopold already said, like many decades ago, was it's this connection between man and land, or we could reframe that as humans and nature. And so that's at the core of stewardship. And then I specifically have looked at how it's through those relationships they manifest themselves in daily practices or rituals, or our relationship to a landscape. And it's how through these practices we sift old traditional knowledges that have created stewardship over millennia, and also enable new new practices for transformation. And I'll speak maybe a bit more about the particular example in which I do that later.
Okay, thank you. So, Terry, what is your immediate sort of reflection when you hear these people, these perspectives, or when you think about young researchers at your department, and what excites you?
The thing that excites me most is the multidimensionality of these approaches and ways of entering into the issues of stewardship. There's so many ways, so many issues, so many ways that can be, things that can be improved, and just seeing so many exciting different ways to do that is, I find exciting.
Yeah. So, okay, so now I think it's time to get into more heavy questions, when we had the warming up. So, which actions are urgently needed, and what types of interventions can actually foster transformation towards stewardship, considering the kind of world that we live in? Jamila, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll try to bring this a bit also more concretely to a case. So I think historically, especially within the development sector, we've often seen interventions that do the opposite of fostering stewardship. And I think that's in part because of the world, or the way that we choose to see the world. In science, we have disciplines and boxes that we fit ourselves into, and we have frameworks that create ecosystems and people that are separated. And of course, a lot of the work that we're celebrating today has been trying to break down those dichotomies. But it's still very much at the core of how it's practiced. So I think that's kind of the challenge in terms of what do we need as the transformation towards stewardship. And I see, I guess, as one of the most exciting ways to overcome this challenge and create interventions that can actually foster transformation towards stewardship is creating the space in which these social ecological relationships that already exist can continue to exist, either to persist if that's already working, to adapt to changing climate or political conditions, for example, or to transform if that's to transform the system, as Per was also saying. And that's going to be contextual, and it's going to be circumstantial. And I think our role as scientists, transdisciplinary scientists, is to create those spaces often as well in which perhaps the most marginalized voices, who may have some of the most strongest perspectives on what stewardship is because they practice it in their daily lives, is celebrated. And I've been working a lot in the Pamir Mountains in Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and we found that food is a really powerful relational way to understand the whole without breaking apart. And it also gives voice to people who are otherwise uncomfortable thinking in these more sectoral ways. So that's something that gives me, I guess, a lot of hope in terms of how to intervene. And I think that can then become a patchwork at a global scale. So if things are working locally, how can we quilt those together to make global transformative change? Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any additional reflections on this from Patrick or Caroline or Terry? So, okay, so, but I was thinking then, so this is what gives you hope. But then we are also confronting with some challenges, and I'm just not talking about challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss, but also, and Terry mentioned like the problem of social media, but you sort of went a bit fast through it. And so what are the main challenges then? If we see hope, so what is it that we need to overcome? I'm thinking of, is it disinformation that we see today or in social media? Or is it human behavior, that we are just animals of habit, and no matter if we want to act, we just don't do it because we just don't reflect enough? Because so that leads me to then, and the challenge of the structure, the institutional structure that we have today, those actions that you were talking about, we cannot only leave it to the individuals, because society actually, we cannot all be Greta Thunberg. We cannot just all not fly, because that's not how society works. Is this the main challenge? So what is your kind of idea or reflection on what we need to overcome? Yeah?
So the way I think a major challenge here is that I think environmental biosphere stewardship have become very politicized, and it's very much attached to a liberal agenda, which means that when you know, if you choose to be vegetarian, you're already placed in a certain idea and like a mindset. I worked with seafood, and seafood has very long been like a statement what you care about. Here in Sweden, it's been, if you stopped eating Baltic cod, that was like, you care about the Baltic, or if you stop eating tuna, yeah, you have that's, and some people just don't care and they eat everything. So I think that detachment between the political views and biosphere stewardship really needs to happen. Just as we think about human health, we need to think about biosphere health for everyone.
Yeah, maybe I can add to that. So what is quite interesting that in the behavioral literature, so this engagement with to what extent worldviews or values are driving actual behavior hasn't actually been looked at so much, but it came up now today several times that this is, of course, like a bit like the elephant in the room. And I see it as a really big challenge to find this right balance, that there are actions that we need to take that are also very political, as Patrick just highlighted. There are all actions we have to take, that what Jamila mentioned, from specific places and in very different contexts. But then I think we also need to engage really with, so what are actually the worldviews and the values of these type of political and economic systems that are really kind of driving the development at the moment, and to really question that. But that is really, I see this as a huge challenge. But I think we need to find ways to engage with it, and maybe the first one would be to give it that space, that these worldviews and values or this care really influences our behavior.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I guess what I see as the biggest challenge is this paradox, I think, that also came up a few times today, of living in the Anthropocene, hyper-connected, and the spread and the speed. And at the same time, a lot of what we've been talking is the stewardship. And where does stewardship come from? It comes from this relationship to land or place, however you define that for yourself, also as an individual. So I see this really, a bit as a paradox theoretically, because a lot of the concepts that we use at a local level feel like they don't theoretically map onto this hyper-connected, quick pace, whether it's stewardship or biocultural or sense of place. Those, and I think that's kind of an exciting research frontier. And then at a personal level, and I loved the photos, Terry, of your 100 years of place connection, and so maybe that goes to something that would be nice to talk to you more about. It's something that I feel also faced very much so as a researcher about how do we act stewardship, how do we be stewardship, or how do we be the transformation? Studying it is part of it, and yeah, I think that's a challenge at a personal level. As well.
Thank you.
I'm intrigued with some of the people that we think of as the bad actors that are creating problems, the vested interests and so forth, and also really impressed at the way some corporations have really stepped up and done wonderful things. I'd like to know more about the heterogeneity of values and willingness to step up and really make a difference among groups that we associate with being the problems in the Anthropocene. It seems like there are some real opportunities there that are going to take some exploration with careful listening and exploration of social networks that are, to me, presently invisible.
Yeah, so my own sort of about scaling up and what I sort of thinking about is this whole knowledge, care, and agency. You know, who needs to care, who needs to know, and who has the agency, and looking at the local, I mean, at the individual level, we can all be stewards, so to speak. But if you scale up more and more, maybe these needs to be complementary. So these big actors with a lot of power, they have agency, but they may not necessarily have the knowledge maybe. But then by collaborating with the scientists, they get the knowledge. And then my question is, do they care? And what do they care about? I think that is, I hope that with engaging with the scientists, they actually care. So this is just my own personal reflections. I don't know if you have.
I'm sure that among these groups, there are some individuals that really care, and they've got strong social networks to people who might respect those people for being part of that social network, but may not care. So that working through those messengers, trusted messengers in these groups, I think could be really powerful.
Yeah. Okay, here's another tough question for you. I want to talk about looking where we are now and what you have accomplished so far, and also Terry, with your perspective, being in this field for a long time, but also looking ahead with the challenges. We have this 10-year sort of we fix the climate kind of thing. So but also looking beyond that, what if we do fix the climate? So there's also these kinds of long term. So what are research frontiers and challenges, both right now, but also, you know, in a continuum sort of space? Do you have any reflections? I'm sure you do.
Maybe I'll just add a quick reflection because it came up, I think, today from the crowd as well about, if we solve the climate crisis, that's not like, home free. Like there's going to be, obviously maintaining that will be a challenge in of itself. But I think thinking about these things as processes isn't something that we're very good at in science. And I think we lack the theoretical frameworks to do that. And I think as soon as we have to analyze data, we again fall into these this siloed thinking. And again, there's a lot of, I think, exciting new research there, but even talking about the social and the ecological, we're still really struggling with using even the right words to talk about that. So I think it's exciting, but also a challenge about how to think in this more processual way.
Yeah. More? Do you have any more to say about that? Yeah, full of thinking. Yes.
No, I can just, I'm just thinking when I hear, I'm just curious to see 10 years from now, like which countries, which societies have actually come up with a solution and what that would look like and how that would affect other nations and other, like, because, you know, you're giving up some things, but you're getting a lot of benefits too. So if that will be a catalyst, yeah. And of course, depending on which solution that is, that's going to also determine which new problems are going to appear. Like at some point we were running out of whales for oil, but we solved that only to replace it with another problem.
Yeah. So I guess for me it's been this, I like that you took up the carbon tax as an example, because I also think there is this false dichotomy between that you cannot use real sort of interventions that are based in a market-based or economy-based types of interventions, while also nurturing care and these other sort of soft values. I think a research challenge is to find when they are complementary and when they are not. That is just what excites me. Okay, before I let in the audience, do you want to ask each other a question or not? Putting you on the spot here, maybe, but no. Okay.
Nice to hear from.
Yes,
I
so
think
let's
it's nice
bring
to
in the
invite.
audience and get some questions for the panel, questions that you have. Yes, up there. I have a question. In the back.
There and there.
Yeah, and I guess we can also use this one, and then maybe if we can.
Thank you. I'm Anne-Sophie Crépin from the Bay Institute of Ecological Economics. Thank you for all this presentation and nice panel discussion. So my question was inspired actually by Per and Kalle's presentation, but I think it would be great if you could answer it. So they talk about these phases of transformation, when you have the preparation phase and then you have more like the navigating phase. So would it be possible in the preparation phase to actually prepare for this navigating phase so that it actually becomes more successful and not it's just a random way which path you take? And then I have another question, which was about the path of this transformation, because Per was worried that it's going to be needed a fast transformation. But on the other side, everything is going very much faster now. So is it a challenge or is it an asset? Thank you.
Yes. Now we have to share this one. So, who wants to? Yeah. Per, do you feel like you want to answer the transformation
Yes,
question?
Yeah, right. But I mean, I think it'd be interesting to hear from you, Per. But I guess I would just, in terms of the preparation phase, I think it's, who, because the power questions of who is there and I guess thinking about stewardship also, if you're thinking of stewardship as like a thoughtful transformation in a sense. So I think the preparation phase depends on a very deliberate idea of agency and who has the agency within that preparatory phase. Prepare?
Okay.
I didn't answer your second question.
No, it was about the speed. If it's an asset, and if it's also something we need to worry about, or can it be turned, and when can it now be into an asset? And yeah, I mean, of course, I can just give my idea then. That of course it can both be a problem and an asset, and I think that we need to understand better social media and what's going on there. So we know. I think it's a research field that we really need to get into, also as scientists dealing with this information, and also that people actually don't trust science anymore, and a lot of that is because it's strategic disinformation in social media. So I think that as scientists we actually need to be worried, but also be smart about it and learn about it.
And I think maybe just again to reflect a lot of what I was hearing today, this a bit of a paradox between the speed in which we have to act and be ready to act, but also the slow processes of trust building and of care. Those are not fast processes. So I think that's really interesting in terms of a lot of the social movements we're seeing all around the world in 2019. What are the slower processes that are taking place at the same time in order to sustain those? That's just a reflection off of today. Yeah.
We have a few more questions over here. First, we have a question up
Hello?
over there. Yes.
Yeah, I had a question about the bad actors, because this idea that society has to change, that the top 10% cause 50% of the damage, within the group of people that resist change, resist the fusion of new ideas that would enhance stewardship. There are bad actors that you can say don't behave rationally because they have this incentive to work against the system in a way that it's kind of suicidal to do what they do, but they benefit, locally. For example, the United States pulling out of the Paris Accord, that would be, they will gain an advantage. In terms of game theory, they will win because they don't have to play the game with everyone else. So how do you punish those transgressors? What is the, like, because everything here seems so positive and to build positive change, but how do you punish the people that prevent a build towards positive change?
Well,
one possibility would be looking for ways in which coordination among good actors can provide them with opportunities that would then be, that the bad actor would be left out of, such as trade agreements that would allow the good actors to allow them beneficial trade arrangements that the bad actor would be excluded from. If they choose not to play in this sandbox, then leave them out.
yes. Okay, we have a few questions here. I don't know which one. I think on this row, yes, over here, and then up there, if we have time.
Thank you. So I'm a high school student, and I think that it was interesting how social media was mentioned, and I think that's pretty relevant for my generation, being even younger than the millennials and everything, and being probably the ones most affected by climate change going into the future. What would you recommend, like how would you recommend a regular student or regular person who's maybe not a scientist who to inform themselves and educate themselves and be stewards without that background? I think it's really easy for people to go to social media. I know it is for me, just to find resources, and I don't know where to start to look for better resources that are maybe more reliable or so I don't know if you have any recommendations.
I can say foremost, use more than one resource.
Yeah, but I would actually also like to add that I think there are really good sources also out there in social media. I mean, I'm now just thinking of the accounts that, I mean, like Greta Thunberg, or also the students that lead the Fridays for Future campaigns in Germany. They have actually really great accounts in social media that I actually was curious about and looked at. So I would actually, definitely agree using different sources, but then also maybe there needs to be some more filtering. But they are, and that's certainly harder because the offer is really wide, but it's also there. I mean, I would not dismiss it either.
And I would also say have conversations, with people around you. You also asked about how to spread this or how, you can, so have conversations. I think dialogues, like Terry said, it's good. We have
Thank you.
the button there.
Okay. Thank you. So we talk a lot about the concepts of socio-ecological and systems and use different words. So on the ground, if you're actually trying to implement that, for example, in a community of about 8,000 people or in an integrated catchment study, have you got any experience in what kind of metrics you would use or essential variables that you would need to measure so that 10 years from now you could say, yes, we're on our way on a different trajectory to good stewardship?
Go ahead, but it'd be interesting to hear from you, Terry, with all your experience on that. So something, I don't have a very good answer, just about what I've been experimenting with, and it'd be nice to talk more with you about that, is trying to have very inductive approaches, of course, and not going into a community expecting to see something. As Terry also said, you like just this, as also as Danella Meadow says, is radically letting go of your own paradigms. And I think from my side, at least, the data collection part is easy, or follow relatively, whether it's from a more anthropological or ethnographic approach and allowing these things to emerge. And what I find quite difficult then is how to analyze that data using the words and language that we have, and then communicating that to a scientific audience, and when it's useful to communicate that to a scientific audience or not. So in terms of the metrics used, I've recently been trying to look more at, rather than entities themselves, actually analyzing the relationships and the frequency of those relationships, for example. And then that's then given back also to the communities, often in quite abstract ways, like paintings or other different pieces of artwork, or different knowledge repositories. And then that would be really cool if there was 10 years of research funding to go back 10 years later and see what that looked like. But I think it's something I'm experimenting with, and it would be, really nice to hear more from you, maybe Terry, on that.
I would think that slow variables would be things to keep track of, things that are changing slowly and less likely to just be bouncing around. And so, for example, from an ecological perspective, soil retention in a watershed. From a social perspective, I'm not sure what it would be. What would be the slow variables?
I would say trust could be one.
Good, yeah.
But how do you measure that?
Sure. There are some, we can have some psychology tests that are quite well established that can be used.
But also acknowledge that there are just some things that you cannot measure. Like you have a metrics for it, and we cannot forget about those like values. And I mean, how do you measure that? So I think that is also that there are just things we cannot measure. Like trust is difficult to measure, for example. Okay, I think we have one more question. I don't know who was, I think it was in this row, yes, and then.
Thank you. My question is regarding to knowledge. We've been talking about it a lot, and it's definitely something that's driving then the agency and everything else. So as we see, the sustainability power is undeniable to that 2 million different groups working on this. However, is it enough for the knowledge to be gathered in a spontaneous way as it's being done right now? Because something that's, in my opinion, visible, the need for knowledge, for the general knowledge, the quantity of that general knowledge is much larger than it was 10 and 20 or 50 years ago. But I'm not sure I see the systematic ways of people being educated about this. But it is, again, as we mentioned, social media and what you find, and politics also trying to be messengers of truth or wrong in this. Do you see the need and the mean of how knowledge could be spread in a very scientific way to larger masses? Thank you.
I can refer to something we talked about at lunch today, was that in Italy now they have put climate change, education in climate change as part of the school curriculum. So that's a pretty cool way of distributing knowledge, of course. But I think generally giving the public better access and better knowledge to interpret scientific texts, and also for us to write texts that are much more digestible for a broader public.
Yeah, I would like to directly add to this, what you just said, Patrick. So I think it's also at the same time thinking about that there needs to be this knowledge accessible. I think we need to think much more in how we present it. Because it's not just about presenting the knowledge and then everyone will act on it, because there are lots of behavioral studies that have shown that that's not the way it goes. And we found that also in our own work. So we need to do much more work in how people perceive different types of information and different types of knowledge and how it is presented. So I actually think that's really, it's kind of the classic answer, but we need to do more research on that as well, because it's definitely not just about putting the knowledge out there. That's not enough, I think.
Yeah, I guess just if I can add one thing, I think, and Maria mentioned a little bit the IPBS report, for example, which she's worked a lot on different types of knowledges as well. So it's not just exactly about putting the scientific knowledge out there, but knowing also how to have these parallel knowledges that exist, and then how to filter out misinformation, for example, from that, because it's not that all knowledge is equal. It's not about that. So it's a really tricky question. And then I think, again, something I like about the Care Knowledge Agency framework is that, yeah, knowledge itself isn't enough for stewardship action. Yeah, so just to reiterate what everyone said.
I wonder whether co-production of knowledge is not only a useful way of generating knowledge, but also a way of figuring out what knowledge is going to be useful, more or less in that framework that Maria presented. Because knowledge that some people that scientists might find useful, other practitioners might find less useful. And if there's dialogue between different groups, then there may be a greater chance of consensus about what kinds of knowledge and what kinds of studies would really make a difference.
Yeah. And with those wise words, we end the panel. So, thank you. Great, thank you.